If you'd like to help support this channel, visit eguitarplans.com and buy a plan. Now on with the video. Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. If you like to build or repair guitars, I suggest you click that subscribe button down below and you'll become part of a community of fellow luthiers. And together, we can take your skills to a whole new level. In this episode, I'm going to be covering part 6 of the Highline Echo laminated top guitar build. And that means I'm going to be finishing this next. So let's jump in and get started. Lately, I've been on this kick of installing glow-in-the-dark fret marker dots on my guitar necks. And I know it's kind of gimmicky, but folks seem to really like it. You know, they like to be able to see their fret marker dots in a dark environment. And with the strontium illuminate powders that are currently available pretty much everywhere, Amazon, eBay, they can glow for hours after they've been charged, and charging them simply involves exposing them for a few seconds to sunlight, or you can use one of those cheap UV flashlights that you can find also on Amazon and eBay. But to install them, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the position of the dots using a scribing tool. Then I'll drill out those marks with a 3/16 inch diameter drill bit, and I'll drill to a depth of about 1/8 of an inch. And since I want these marker dots to be visible in daylight as well as in the dark, I decided to treat them the same way that I did the marker dots on the top of the fretboard. So I found a piece of 3/16 inch diameter plastic tubing and I cut it into small 1/8 inch long sections and then placed each one of those sections into the holes that I drilled. And then I found the easiest way to fill the hole in that plastic tubing was to pack it with the glow-in-the-dark powder. So I just simply removed them and then used a pair of tweezers to hold them while I tapped them into a pile of that blue strontium illuminate powder until the hole was completely filled, and then I just dropped it back into the hole I drilled into the fretboard. And then I placed a drop of CA glue on top of it to let that soak in and bond the two together. And once the CA glue had dried, I went back with a sanding block and some coarse sandpaper, probably about 150 grit, and sanded down the marker dots and the excess glue until it was flush with the size of the fretboard. Next, I used my random orbital sander with a succession of sanding grits, starting out with a 150 grit, and then I worked my way up to 220 and then finished with a 400 grit Mirka Abranet disc. To sand the fretboard, I used my 30-inch long, 12-inch radius sanding block, and I began the process of sanding using a 220 grit sandpaper, and the goal here is to make sure that the radius is perfect, the tool marks have been removed, and the fretboard from end to end is perfectly straight. And to check my progress, I grabbed a radius gauge and checked the surface of the fretboard's radius to make sure that it was true from end to end. I also used a precision straight edge to make sure that the fretboard was perfectly straight with no gaps. And to final sand the neck, I used 400 grit sandpaper wrapped around a piece of a large dollar store eraser. These things work great as sanding blocks. And since I'm not really concerned with changing any surface shapes with 400 grit, I didn't have to worry about altering the radius or the back contour. What I was trying to do was eliminate the 220 grit sanding scratches and replace it with a nice smooth 400 grit surface. After I'd finished with the 400 grit and before I could apply the finish, it was critical that I clean out the fret slots from any sanding dust. Otherwise, the finish I'm about to apply would gum up those slots and really create a mess to clean up. I'm going to be applying a hand-rubbed oil finish, and I'll be doing so using a clean cloth. And what I like to do is fold in the edges to make sure that I don't leave any lint on the surface as I'm applying the oil. And in this case, I'll be using Wacko Danish Oil as my finish. With a liberal coat of the Wacko Danish Oil applied, I could hang up the neck and let it dry for a few days. And of course, I laid out the oil-soaked rags and gloves on my concrete floor to let them dry so that they won't spontaneously combust in my shop. Okay, I know you're probably wondering why I used Danish oil instead of boiled linseed oil. After all, I've used boiled linseed oil in the past, and I've talked about how much I like it as a finish for guitar necks. It's one of my favorite finishes. Well, in truth, Danish oil is boiled linseed oil. The difference is it has a pigment added to it, as well as some solvents which help that pigment soak into the wood. That's really the only difference there is. So if you want a natural oil finish that has some color to it, I would recommend using Danish oil. It's easier to use. You don't have to mix up anything. It's already done for you. If, however, you want just that subtle golden amber tint that you get from an oil finish, I would recommend using the boiled linseed oil. And here's a tip. If you want that boiled linseed oil to dry really fast, which typically it takes several days for it to dry, you can add a couple of drops of Japan dryer to it, and it will dry very quickly. In fact, I find that I can apply it, let it sit overnight, and the next day it's dry to the touch, and I can continue working on the neck by pressing in the frets. With Danish oil, you could probably also add the Japan dryer. However, I haven't actually done that myself. And in fact, on this neck, I just applied the straight Danish oil, let it sit overnight, and it still feels pretty tacky. I know that I'm going to probably have to let this dry and cure for at least 2 or 3 more days before I can proceed with pressing in the frets. I ended up applying 2 coats of the Wacko Danish oil and let that dry for several days. Then what I did next was I wet sanded the surface using mineral spirits as a lubricant, and I started out with a 600 grit wet dry sandpaper. Then I progressed to 800, 1000, 1200, and then 1500. And these of course are all P grade sandpapers. The result is a surface feel that is absolutely silky smooth, which is what guitar players really love. The next task to perform was the installation of my stainless steel frets, and what I'm doing here is I'm cutting each length of fret to match the specific fret position on the neck. And as you can see, I have to put considerable force in cutting this fret wire because it is, after all, stainless steel, which is much harder than nickel silver. Since the fret slots that I cut stop short of the edge of the fretboard, I'm going to have to remove a small portion of the tang from each end of the fret wire, and I'm doing that using my trusty Symptoms fret tang nipper. It does a great job of just clipping off that little bit of tang from each end. And even though that fret tang nipper makes quick work of removing the tang, I still like to hit it with a fret file just to remove what little of the tang remains so that it doesn't lift the end of the fret off the fretboard when I press it in. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of CA glue to the tang of the fret before I press it down in. This will help hold the fret into position better. It will also flood the slot so there are no gaps between the tang and the fretboard wood. And I've found that since I've already applied the Wacko Danish oil earlier, any remaining CA glue that squeezes out from the frets can be easily wiped off the fretboard. Now it was time to bevel the fret edges, and I used my technique of belt sanding off those ends at a roughly 35-degree angle. This is something you should only do with a little bit of practice because it would be easy to really mess up a neck if you weren't careful. At this point, the neck is finished. It's ready to be installed in the body of the guitar. However, I haven't made the body yet. I always make my necks all the way to completion before I make the body. The reason I do this is because then I can actually use the neck itself to precisely determine the depth of my neck pocket. And the way I do this is I'm going to measure the thickness of the heel, including the fretboard and the fret wire. So I'll use my digital calipers, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the measurement between the center line of the neck and the edge of the neck, right at the heel, at the back of the heel. And as it turns out, the overall thickness is 1.25 inches. So what I'll do now is I will measure the height of my bridge when the saddles are in the lowest position. And that measurement is taken from the bottom of the base plate to the bottom of the notch that the strings are sitting in. And that dimension is then subtracted from the thickness of the heel. So if, for example, my bridge height at its lowest position is 0.3 inches, I would subtract that from the 1.25, and what I get is 0.95 inches. That's how deep I need to make the neck pocket. When I do that, the neck is going to sit down into the body so that when the strings, when the bridge saddles are in their lowest position, the strings will be just touching the top of the fret wire. From there, I can raise those saddles and gradually raise my string height from the lowest possible string action to pretty much the highest possible string action. I have the greatest degree of adjustability. So that's what I'm going to do next. And once I've done that, in the next episode, you'll see me actually starting to carve the body. So until then, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave any questions or comments you might have about this episode, and I'll see you next week.